Hey everybody, Chris Serena here with Sultana Education Foundation's Virtual Classroom. Today we're going to be talking about the African American experience at sea. So when we look through the hundreds and hundreds of pages of Sultana's logs, they never mention the race of a sailor with one exception, and it's right here. It says Prince Gould, a black man, entered on board. So what was life like for this black sailor here in the British Royal Navy? So before we get into the life of Prince Gould, it's important to understand the climate that he was sailing in here in the colonies in the 18th century. We have to remember that the entire economic system, both in the West Indies and the 13 colonies, was really built on the backs of slave labor. For those unfortunate captives in Africa to become slaves, the voyage really took place in three distinct segments. The first segment generally involved being captured in Africa by slave traders and then marched overland to trading posts on the west coast of that continent. There, European slave traders would force Africans onto slave ships. These ships were notoriously overcrowded and unsanitary, as evidenced by the harrowing illustration of the interior of the slave ship Brooks from 1788. The voyage from Africa to the West Indies or the colonies was known as the Middle Passage. This was such a brutal passage that millions of Africans lost their lives along the way. For those that survived, they were sold at slave auctions and then began the third and final leg of their journey, which was from the slave sale to their final destination, whether that be a sugar plantation in the West Indies, the cotton fields of the Deep South, or the tobacco and agricultural fields somewhere here in Maryland or Virginia. For those studying the African American experience at sea, there's two life stories that are really fascinating to look at. One is the story of Ola Aqueon. He was born in present-day Nigeria, captured at a very young age, survived the Middle Passage, and ultimately ended up being enslaved on a farm field in Virginia. It just so happened his owner was a lieutenant in the Royal Navy. Aqueon later joined him in the Navy and became a skilled and professional sailor, traveled all over the world, eventually earned enough money to buy his own freedom at the age of 21, and then spent the latter part of his life trying to abolish slavery in England. Another story is that of James Fortin. Fortin was actually born a free man in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. He was a privateer for the Continental Forces during the Revolutionary War. He later owned his own sail loft, employed 40 people, amassed a small fortune, and he too spent the latter half of his life trying to abolish slavery here in the colonies. So what was life like for Prince Gould? Like Fortin, we know he was born right here in the colonies in Rhode Island. We know he had enlisted on Sultana on April 1st, 1769. He was listed as an able-bodied sailor. At age 45, he was by far the oldest sailor that we know of on Sultana's crew. We know from the logbooks that Gould worked on Sultana for about 8 months until he was discharged in Virginia on November 22nd, 1769. An interesting detail is that we know from a notation in the logs that he was bursted, which means he had a hernia. The fact that Gould was older at 45 and injured with a hernia means that perhaps he might have worked down here as the ship's cook, as that was an occupation that was often occupied by older, injured sailors. It also appears that since he enlisted of his own volition and was discharged by the Navy, that he may have been a free man. So while Prince Gould never became as famous during his lifetime as Ola Aqueon or James Fortin did in theirs, he does provide us with a fascinating glimpse of the role of black sailors here in the 13 colonies. In addition to serving on the Royal Navy, it would not have been uncommon here on the Chester River to see sloops and schooners manned entirely by black sailors, both free and enslaved. And this is a piece of our history that is often invisible and often forgotten in history textbooks. In addition to bringing their labor, Africans also brought new ideas about politics and religion, arts and architecture, food and music, and many other aspects of their culture that still reverberate in American society today. For those of you who want to learn more about the African American experience at sea in the Chesapeake region, this is a great read, Blackjacks by W. Jeffrey Bolster. That's all for today's edition of Sultana's Virtual Classroom. We hope you'll join us here for more cool videos.